What was it you wanted to say right as we were about to begin?
Yeah, the city of Loyalton is a unique situation because the city contracted with CalPERS in 1986, but in 2013 they decided to end their contract with us. And that's different than other employers because at that point in time, CalPERS, who's administering the pensions, no longer has the ability to get contributions from the city. So we have to bill them for the amount of money to pay these retirees for their lifetime. And the risk is now borne to CalPERS, and that's something that we have to pay that obligation off over time.
Okay, we're going to talk about that. That seems like the excuse as to why a $1.6 million bill.
Right.
Right, no, I get that.
Yeah.
But let me talk, generally with
Sure.
you. This is the first time ever that retirees who are part of the CalPERS system are going to have their pensions cut. Is that accurate?
That's correct. It's the first time that CalPERS has had to cut pensions to retirees, and it's unfortunate. It's a decision that we regret we had to make, but you have to remember that pensions are a shared responsibility. It's a responsibility between the employer, the employee, and CalPERS. And we administer the pensions, and the employers make that obligation on behalf of their employees as part of their compensation.
And this is going to be roughly a 60% cut for those four benefit receivers, correct?
Roughly, let me ask, Amy, it's 40%, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah.
It's a 40% cut.
40% cut.
Okay. So what is the message this sends, do you think, to, you have 1.8 million people who are active, still working, or are retired, or are, the beneficiaries of CalPERS retirees. What does it say to them that for the first time in 85 years, 4 people are going to have their pensions cut?
Yeah, I think for all of our beneficiaries, the thing they should know is CalPERS is a healthy system. We have the ability to pay pensions for the long term. But the obligation that the employer has made is an obligation that they have to keep. And so in this case, the city of Loyalton wasn't able to fulfill that obligation. And in a situation as unfortunate as it is, as the administrator of the pensions, we're forced to take action and reduce those pensions.
You just made a claim that CalPERS is a healthy system. Joe Nation over at Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research would absolutely disagree with what you just said. It's not a healthy system.
Well, we're 68% funded, and so we have 68% of the assets that we need to pay benefits for the long term.
Well, let's put this in your numbers.
Sure.
You have a liability of $463 billion in the long term, of which you have assets totaling $299 billion, but you are missing. You have a debt, essentially, of $163 billion. That doesn't sound very healthy to me. $163 billion is what you need if you had to make good on all of this now.
Right, but remember, pensions are a long-term investment. We look at it over a 20 or 30-year period. We don't have to pay all the benefits now. We have to pay the benefits over the long term, and so what CalPERS is doing to help in this situation is reducing the risks, the costs, and the complexity in the fund. Those are the levers that we have to pull to ensure the long-term sustainability of the system.
So when you talk about the funding level of the system, CalPERS, its board has determined a rate of return of roughly 7.5%.
Correct.
On average. And yet, it historically is just not the case. You'd have to go back almost 30 years for CalPERS to get that kind of return. The last time was 7.7%, 1986. The last 20 years, the rate of return has been 6%. The last 10 years, it's been 3.2%. The last 5, 6.7%. And for the last 3, 1%. The reason I mention that is you talk about a long-term view. That $163 billion shortfall actually gets worse based upon CalPERS' own projected rate of return, which doesn't really exist.
And that's why our board is considering lowering that rate of return. In fact, they're doing it next week in a meeting. The staff's going to recommend that we lower our, what often is referred to as the discount rate, or the return on our investments, lower than the 7.5%.
But what does that say to the retirees? And you know, the board makes the decision.
Correct.
CalPERS staff has been telling the board to lower that rate of return for years. It's never been what CalPERS said it would be.
No, actually, that's not true.
That's what
Because if you look at the long-term projections, only in recent years has it fallen below the 7.5%. There's been times over the 20 or 30-year period that we were well above the 7.5%. It's the last couple years where we've earned less than 1% or a negative return where it's actually fallen down below. So the 5, the 10, and the 20, and the 30-year returns have only fallen down below in the last couple of years. If you look historically before that, we were well above those 7.5% returns.
Okay, but and I'll give that we had an economic calamity
Sure.
worldwide that contributed to that. But if that's the case, then why lower the discount rate if CalPERS was zooming along just fine, say, before 2006?
Because now what our investment staff have looked at is over the next 10 years, the financial markets aren't going to return what we expected. And that's just a global phenomenon. All pension funds are maturing, and CalPERS is one of those. And so when we look at the next 10 years, our investment team and our consultants average that we might be able to earn 6.4% return on the asset allocation that we have today. So we have to look at lowering that investment return to really manage to the realities of the fund and to ensure that we're sustainable for the long term. And those are decisions that our board has to make, and they're going to be considering those over the next couple months.
And to make sure that the pensioners who are counting on those checks every month when they retire, because
Right.
as the returns drop, each member of CalPERS, the municipalities and the different municipal entities that contribute, their contribution will go up as that rate of return goes down, will it not?
It will go up in the short term, and over a period of time, long term, it will go back down. So what we're looking at now, and let me back up about the pension fund dynamics. So we're in a negative cash flow position. We're paying out more in benefits than we're taking in contributions, both from contracting employers and from our members.
You're not taking in enough from employees, employers.
So let's talk about the dynamics of the CalPERS system. Today we stand in a negative cash flow position. So we're paying out more in benefits than we're bringing in from employer contributions and contributions from the members themselves. So that means we have to sell assets to make up that shortfall, to pay benefits on a monthly basis.
Or have your members contribute more money. You could have, the municipality could raise taxes and contribute more to meet its funding obligations.
Right. The members could contribute more money, but that's not a decision that CalPERS can make. That's legislative or bargaining between employees and employers. What we control is the investments. And we don't set the benefits. Those are set by the employers and through the legislature. So what we have to look at is how can we reduce the risk in the fund and the costs that we pay to run this fund. And members are living longer and more people are retiring. So what we're looking at is reducing what we assume on our investment return to ensure that more contributions are flowing into the system and that it's sustainable for the long term.
But that, and I realize CalPERS can't control the 3,000 plus different municipal entities that contribute, but that's where taxpayers are in kind of squeeze, because all of these different municipal entities have made promises and contractual obligations, and in some ways the only way to meet those is, and to fund their requirements to CalPERS is going to be raising taxes or selling assets that they might have in order to cover these bills.
Yes, so as we lower our discount rate, it does mean increased contributions to employers, but we've talked to employers and they understand the impact, but they also understand the necessity, because pensions are a recruitment and retention tool for them. It's part of compensation for public employees. It's part of the services that they provide to citizens.
But here's, and I realize Loyalton right now, let's hope, is an anomaly and an offshoot. But for the first time ever, we had a small town which had economic difficulty and made a decision. I'm not going to make a judgment call whether it was right or wrong, but made a decision to terminate. And in order for their 4 retirees who are part of the system to continue to receive full benefit, CalPERS said they'd have to pay $1.6 million. What is that $1.6 million?
So when a city or a county or a special district terminates, we no longer have the ability to take contributions from that city. So CalPERS is now on the hook to pay the pension that that city has promised to these retirees for their lifetime. So we need to look at what assets that city has in our system. Now, we commingle the assets for investment purposes, but
you're looking at what Loyalton paid in on behalf of those 4
right,
people.
They were only 40% funded. So we have to calculate how much money do we need to pull into the system to pay those 4 retirees for their lifetime. And it's larger than what you would assume in our normal investment portfolio.
It's what you, why is it the 7.5%?
No, the amount of money that we required from the city of Loyalton is larger because we invest that money more conservatively. We don't assume the 7.5%.
You assume a much lower discount rate.
We assume a much lower discount rate because
Why?
we have to preserve that capital.
But why wouldn't you, but you don't do that for CalPERS now. I mean, CalPERS, you just said we assume a much lower discount rate for those 4 individuals.
Right.
Because it's a less risky, actually, plan going forward.
Correct.
Why wouldn't you do that with the total CalPERS fund now?
Because the uniqueness with Loyalton is they've terminated their contract and there's no more contributions flowing into the system. But with the other employers, they continue to make contributions on a long-term basis. And we believe that whether the 7.5% is correct today, that may change. We believe that we can earn a higher return and we don't have to preserve that capital like we do with the city of Loyalton.
The critics of CalPERS, and I realize Loyalton triggered this situation by the city council's decision, but the critics say you're having your cake and eating it too. You just said we can assume, and you're going to recommend next week that they lower it, but we can assume a 7.5% return on investment, when in fact we're going to tell these other people, no, it's more like a 2 3/4 return on investment.
Well, that's because the city of Loyalton decided to end its relationship with us. And we have to put the protections in place
but you have
to
the
pay
assets,
those obligations.
But you have the assets that they paid prior already.
Only 40%.
Only 40%, but why wouldn't that 40% earn 7.5% as CalPERS predicted as opposed to 2 3/4?
It's only 40%. We have to preserve the capital that we have. And they're all individual plans. So even on that 40%, we have no way for contributions. Remember, the other employers are continuing to make contributions into the system. The city of Loyalton is not.
It still sounds like you're a double, not a double-edged sword. It sounds like have 2 standards. One that lets CalPERS be overly optimistic, and one that is almost dire for the city of Loyalton. But you haven't clearly explained to me why. I mean, I hear your explanation, but you've got, even if it's 40%, you've still got that money. What you're telling me is that money that you're trying to preserve won't grow at the same rate as the rest of the CalPERS funds.
Well, and I think the unique difference is that there's no more employer contributions coming into the system.
Doesn't
from
matter.
The city.
The money's
no, it
there.
really does.
Well, the money, the CalPERS money.
No, it matters because the other employers are paying contributions on the obligation that they made.
Right.
In the case of Loyalton, because they voluntarily terminated, we only have the assets that we have on hand, and we have to have additional money to pay the benefits that they obligated. The city of Loyalton defaulted on their retirees. They made a bad decision, and those retirees are going to suffer for it.
So let me ask you, in regards to that, why are you convinced this won't happen in other towns or cities that are part of CalPERS going forward? Or is there a list of potential, those in trouble who might default?
So there is a silver lining in the story on the city of Loyalton. And the silver lining is that the employers that belong to this system are paying close attention to the obligations that they owe. And they're looking at not only what they owe today, but what also that they owe in the future. And we find very little distressed agencies. And if there are other distressed agencies, they're very small, or they're going out of business or closing in some form or fashion.
But you've had very large cities that were on the verge. They didn't. Stockton, San Bernardino did not default. But those were not large, and they were in distress.
Yeah, but the difference between San Bernardino, Stockton, and Vallejo is those officials in those cities, they've made it very clear that their financial issues run much deeper than pensions. And so it's a myth and really inaccuracy to say that pensions alone tipped those cities over.
That's okay. We keep losing the lights.
Yeah.
Energy efficiency. Thank you, Jimmy Corder. But still, okay, so what percentage, what number of agencies might be facing distress? Small, large, whatever. Do you keep a list?
We monitor collections, certainly. I mean, that's part of our business, is collecting contributions from all of our 3,000 employers. Mm-hmm. And at this point in time, I'd say we have less than 5 that we're talking to about being behind on their contributions or paying us. Even
in the case of San Bernardino and Stockton and Vallejo, yes, the issues that brought about those bankruptcies are greater than just pensions. But bankruptcy is bankruptcy, and had they defaulted, that would have been, and that may still happen. I mean, some of these towns and cities come back into bankruptcy, right. And their elected officials certainly look at whether they're going to default or not. And you can't stop them. CalPERS can't control whether they do that or not. What happens if that rears its head again? San Jose's faced this, Stockton's faced this.
So in the case of Stockton had a choice. They could have stopped paying CalPERS. The judge said that. But the choice that they made was to continue their contributions to the system because they see the importance of public employee pensions. And they've been very clear in public that recruitment and retention of their police, their fire, and the people that work for the city, pensions are important. And so they've continued those obligations. If they had stopped, then we would go through the same process that we would go through with the city of Loyalton. We made 50 calls to the city of Loyalton, 10 notifications asking them to pay. And we would have to do that with any other employer. And ultimately, we'd have to decide if they couldn't pay, if we would have to reduce pensions.
Ultimately, a place like Stockton, politicians will one day look at, they cut, employee benefits. CalPERS has no role in that, but the future benefits. But as taxpayers demand services, and things don't get done because money is being used to maintain current obligations, and roads don't get paved, and potholes don't get filled, and sidewalks don't get repaired, at some point, there's the potential for a city to say, you know what, we're going to have to say goodbye, CalPERS. I mean, I'm trying to predict the future, and I can't. But a lot of people, the former mayor of San Jose, Chuck Reed, says we are on that trajectory for a lot of municipalities in California. And it would seem to me that I would be nervous if I were CalPERS, because I can't stop that. If these municipalities, because they are stressed by the obligations they have to meet for all of their citizens, look at CalPERS and say, we're not going to fund this anymore. I mean, do you guys worry about that?
So we recognize the cost of pensions is increasing, and that cities, counties, special districts all have to figure out how to pay for those obligations. What we also see, though, is they all realize the importance of pensions, and so they're planning for that. What CalPERS can do is look at our investments. Where can we reduce risk? Where can we pay less? Where can we pay less to Wall Street money managers?
Yeah, you had made headlines 2 years ago when you stopped using hedge funds that weren't returning the kind of investment they should have.
What can we eliminate from the portfolio that may not return what we can? And so that's what we're doing. I mean, it's a partnership. Remember, it's a shared responsibility. Yeah. So everyone has a stake in this. But we're confident that over the long term, we can fulfill the mission of this system and provide retirement security to these members.
Who watches out for the taxpayers in all of this, though? Because in the municipalities who are your members, where you can't make decisions, they're the ones who get squeezed, whether it's because roads aren't paved and sidewalks aren't repaired, or with taxes going up to meet contractual obligations. I mean, that's something our courts have not yet determined, but where are we going to go when these contracts might be violated when municipalities say we're not going to honor them, the retirement.
So I think it's important that CalPERS and employers all watch out for taxpayers in these situations. And again, the levers that we have to pull are reduce costs to the system so we can earn more money, because the more money we earn, the less the taxpayers have to foot. But this system was built on a promise, and the promise was our first and foremost duty is to pay these members. And if an employer makes an obligation like the city of Loyalton did, they have to fulfill that obligation. And the city, taxpayers, and members all have to understand that, as well as the policymakers. Now, we've seen pension reform, and that's going to help, but it's going to be over the long term. So today, we have to focus on the reality that's in front of us, and that really is what levers can we pull to make sure that this system stays healthy.
Anything you want to add?
No, I'm trying to think.
I think you got all of it.
Well, I was wondering, are you kind of punishing Loyalton and making an example out of them?
Let me ask you that question, but look at me.
Yeah.
Are you punishing Loyalton? Are they being made an example for the rest of California?
No, we feel for the city of Loyalton. We feel for their 4 retirees. We are not trying to make them an example in this situation, but the reality is that employers made an obligation, and unfortunately they weren't able to fulfill that obligation. And so their actions alone have probably made themselves their own example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.